one of my dear friends.
Rabbi, we had two requests to dedicate the class. The first was from Judy Stieglitz for the Refuah Shalema of their grandson, Nachum Shmuel ben Yochanan Braina. And the other was for Raya Bat Lina, who sounds like she has a pancreatic issue.
Yes. And I offer the prayer for healing for Elliot Zimmett, who's going through surgery today, and also Ilana Zinger. Bradley's wife is going through surgery today, and also our neshama, who has been struggling with a serious ailment, a young woman. She was the only Orthodox high school graduate to be accepted early admission to Harvard. And Harvard is not easy these days, and hopefully she'll be able to feel better and attend. I see Vitali is on. It's good to see everyone. And of course, there's quite a really wonderful to all of you. And if Janet's on and everyone. And permit me just a special welcome to Rav Avi, who, in other words, means so much to me, and I love and respect. Just Ari, it's your time. You should be giving your class, your take on what's happening. You're really showing the way. I want to say this morning a humble word, a teaching first from two of my favorite psukim in Tanakh, and that's from Megillat Esther, and then offer an anecdote how I saw these verses actually used in a moment that was very important for the Jewish people years ago, and then finally try to relate it to Charles Schumer, to Senator Schumer, whom is not a close friend, but whom I know through political activism. I know him quite well. And of course, Schumer always self-proclaims himself as the Shomer Israel, the guardian of Israel. Schumer is a play on the word Shomer, and he speaks of himself as the defender of Israel. And from my perspective, not holding back at all, I believe that his talk the other day on the floor of the Senate, where he intervened in Israeli politics by insisting that the Netanyahu government fall and new elections be held. Just imagine if the Speaker of the Knesset offered those comments about the Speaker or the President of the Senate. I guess he's the Speaker of the Senate, whatever, the majority leader. And so I think that many supporters of Israel feel that the Shomer, he failed to be true to his title. In fact, in a piece that I hope will be published in a large in a large New York daily, when you write op-eds, it's even if it's been accepted, it's only published when it's published. You never know to the last moment, but I opened up with something like he chucked being the Shomer. So you know exactly where I stand on this. It's not that he doesn't care about Israel. I think he does. And in the first half of his talk, he condemned the Hamas massacre of October 7th. He spoke quite well of Israel's right to defend himself. These are important matters. But then he went on, as my father would say sometimes to me, too long. He spoke too long, and talking about how Netanyahu lost his way. This is the way you talk about the prime minister of the state of Israel, arguably the most important Jewish leader in the world, and should be replaced. Leave that up to the Jewish people, leave that up to the state of Israel, the citizens of Israel to decide. And this in general, I think, has been his his MO, which we'll talk about towards the end of these truly humble comments. In the Megillah story, there is this moment. It's probably my favorite spiritual activism sentences in all of the Bible, and we're picking up the Purim story where Mordechai hears of Haman's intentions, the ultimate anti-Semite, to annihilate, literally to annihilate the Jewish people. And he sends a message to Esther. She's the queen. She should intervene. She should intercede. And Esther sends back a message to Mordechai, and she says, look, there's something to fear. I'm afraid to intervene. It's very, very well known. If you walk in on the king without having first been invited in, your life is in jeopardy. And so she's resisting. At that point, she says, I've not been called to the king all these days. In effect, she says, I'm afraid. I can't go in. I'm going to lose my life. And then in chapter 4, sentence 12, which Shuli, who is always there for us, the Torah says, Ve'agidu leMordechai et divrei Esther. And they told Mordechai Esther's response. She was vacillating. These are the sentences that everyone should read, that Schumer should read. Vayomer Mordechai lahashiv el Esther. Mordechai had this message delivered to Esther. These are his words. Al tidami v'nafshech lihimalet bet hamelach mikol haYehudim. Do not imagine, do not think that you, because you're the queen, that you're forever protected. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. That's his first point. You will, whether you like it or not, in the end, no matter how high your position, you will be defined as a Jew. And then he goes on. Ki im hacharesh tacharishi ba'et hazot. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis and do not intervene, he says the following, Mordechai, Revach vatzala yamod laYehudim mimakom acher. Relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another place. Ve'at uvet avich tovedu. While you and your father's house will perish. Umi yodea, and who knows, im le'et kazot higat lemalchut. Who knows, perhaps you've attained this royal position for such a crisis. I'd rather translate the word tovedu. If you step in, fine. It'll be to your credit. But if you don't, Tovedu, the Jews are going to make it. But you will, I understand Tovedu is more softer than perish. You'll be forgotten. And the Jewish people will continue on. Powerful, powerful sentences. It's the kind of sentences, even if you know them, and most people in this shiur know these sentences, it pays to read these sentences over and over. In all my years of political activism, fighting anti-Semitism, deep down I have found, not only in Europe, but in America, I have found that Jews are afraid. They're afraid that if you speak out with strength against anti-Semitism, it'll bring more attention to the Jewish people. The thinking is, the more we speak out, the more we're we're exposed, the more we're vulnerable. And one of my principles of spiritual activism is quite the contrary. The more we speak out, not the more we're vulnerable, but the more we're protected. Stand up. Don't be afraid. And as you've heard me say so many times, look, fear is an emotion, it's a feeling. And feelings are neither right nor wrong, they just are. Feelings are feelings are feelings. There's nothing wrong, there's nothing shameful with being afraid. Fear, if we fear, we often can't control that. But we can control the way we act. And that's, I think, what's the true hero is about. The one who, despite fear, still acts. We have grandchildren in the Israeli army. One, Gavi, is going in on April 17th. That's why Toby and I are heading back. We want to be there at that moment when he crosses the line and he begins his service. And he says, I've told him, I said, at my age now, I wish you wouldn't be a fighter. And he says to me, it's my obligation, it's my responsibility to do my share. And I just hug him. It's not that I'm not worried about him. I am, as hundreds of thousands of parents and grandparents and spouses are worried about their sons and daughters in the army. Of course, there is that worry, but I'm very proud of it. It's not that he's not concerned, and as he said to me, all the soldiers say it. They don't go in without recognizing what the challenges are. There's fear, and he's going into a unit called Kefir, which is a very tough unit. It operates mostly in the Jenin area, so they're really involved house to house. We could take them out by air, but we're concerned about loss of civilian life. And we're told now that the training period, what's called the Hachshara, is going to be probably cut in half because there's a need of manpower. And so the preparation is accelerated so that they can get into battle. He has that concern, but he knows if we don't stand up, if we don't have some self-respect, we'll never be respected. If we don't have some self-dignity, if we don't have that, then we're lost. And that's what Mordechai is telling Esther. Esther, I understand the fear, but this is your moment. Yes, I know you'll be speaking against the anti-Semite. Yes, I know you'll be speaking against the strongest man in the land, Achashverosh, whom some commentators think was not so dumb. He was really a buddy of Haman, and he was part of this whole attack, but he just kind of masked himself and protected himself. So Haman was the front man. True or not true, those are that argument is discussed, is debated in the Talmud itself. And so Mordechai says, this is your moment. If you'll step in, fine, you'll be saved. It'll be good for the Jewish people. It'll be good for you. And if you don't, we're going to make it, with you or without you. And you will have been forgotten. And then, Miodea, who knows, Imla et kazot, he got lemalchut. Alan Dershowitz, in his book Chutzpah, writes about the foreign minister in exile, the Polish foreign minister in exile during World War II. Poland was taken over by the Germans, and so in exile, there were those who were fighting the Germans, and they appointed someone, their foreign minister, whatever that means, and he was given the charge to go to Washington and to try to meet the highest Jew in government from the three branches, and that Jew was Felix Frankfurter, who was a Supreme Court justice. And he goes to Frankfurter, who knew Roosevelt very well, and he tells him what's happening in Europe, in Eastern Europe. He tells him about the death camps and the Shoah, which was unfolding. And Frankfurter, And this anecdote has been seen and is accepted as truth. Frankfurter says, I believe you, but I can't bother. I can't bother Roosevelt with this. He's too busy with other matters. It was his moment. And how is he remembered in the Jewish community? He's more remembered as the person he could have stepped in and didn't, rather as a Supreme Court justice in the United States of America who had, as a Jew, reached a very, very high level of jurisprudence. So Esther hears the plea of Mordechai, hears it. And then we're told in the Megillah, and this is so beautiful, Vatome Esther lashiva Mordechai. As I read this, I have the shivers. Esther says, send a message back. And she says to Mordechai, I've heard you. Thank you. You're right. You've shown me the way. But then, I think in one of the most glorious statements of leadership, and here it's a woman's leadership, she steps in and says, you're right, Mordechai. I've got to step up to the plate, but I'm not going to do it your way. I'm going to do it my way. I have a different idea of how I can succeed, and being on the inside, I think I can do it better. And she says, Lech kenos et kol haYehudim. Go assemble all the Jews. I get emotional when I read this. When we're threatened, what's critical is go assemble all the Jews together, right, left, up, down, religious, whatever that means, not religious, whatever that means. As you know, for me, there's a difference between being religious and being observant, and I don't know who's religious and who's not religious. I'll leave that up to God. Assemble all the Jews who live in Shushan and fast in my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, nights or day. I and my maidens will observe the same fast. And then she says, Ubechein avo el hamelech asher lo chadat. I will come before the king, and she has those two parties, against the rules, against the laws. And throughout the Megillah up to this point, we've been told that once the law was drafted by Achashverosh, that was it. It was immutable. It could not be changed. It was Kedat HaMelech. She says, even though this is the Persian, the Achashverosh way, I will defy what is commonplace here. I will come to the king, a king who rules Kadat. I will come Asher lo Kadat. And we read this in the cantillation of Lamentations of Echa. And if I perish, I perish. And the next sentence, I love this sentence, because this was a battle which was led by a woman. It's an extraordinary feminist statement by Avor Mordechai. So Mordechai went about the city, Vayas kechol asher tzivta alav Esther. And he did just as Esther had commanded him. They were a good team. Mordechai reminded Esther, don't be afraid. And Esther directed the battle. And ultimately, of course, we were victorious. So I'd like to tell you a story, which I quote in the book, Open Up the Iron Door. I don't know if you have that with you, Shuli, but it's on page 84. So I want to bring you back 50 years. This is 50 years ago to a scene where I saw these sentences quoted by a then senior rabbi. In 1974, I wasn't yet 30 years old. I was even younger than Rav Avi is now. Really a young rabbi, and just starting out in the rabbinate, in my activist world, just having come to Riverdale, in the boiler room, no less, but was already by then, with many others, involved in the Soviet Jewry movement. And the activist felt that what was critical for the freedom of Soviet Jews was what was then called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. Jackson was Henry Jackson, the great senator from Washington State. Vanik was a congressman who was, I think, less pure in motivation than Jackson, but he'll always be remembered as a co-author of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And that was an amendment which tied trade from the United States to the Soviet Union with the freedom of immigration from the Soviet Union. Or to say it quite simply, more simply, if the Soviets wanted American trade, American wheat, and it was very important to them at that time, then there was a precondition. They would have to open up the doors so that people who wanted to leave the Soviet Union could, and it was understood that this was primarily directed at the Jews who were then pushing hard to leave the Soviet Union. There were many, not all, but many in leadership. They wanted to live as Jews in the Soviet Union, but if they were not permitted to live as Jews, which they were not permitted, they said, we want out. But of course, there was the Iron Curtain, and the Soviets weren't allowing them to leave. That was the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. The problem was that Jackson-Vanik was in Congress. That was a congressional amendment. The executive branch, President Reagan, and for that matter, Henry Kissinger, about whom I have serious, serious questions on so many levels in terms of what he did and what I think he didn't do for Israel and even for Soviet Jewry. I'll just give you an example about Jackson, about Kissinger, which I quote in my book, that the New York Times revealed tapes from the Nixon White House, this one coming from March 1st, 1973, and it's available. And this tape is a tape immediately after Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir visited the Oval Office to ask Nixon and Prime Minister and to ask Nixon and Kissinger to intervene on behalf of Soviet Jewry. The tape of that conversation reported Kissinger as saying the following. This is Kissinger's words on the tape. The emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy. And if they put Jews in gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern, maybe a humanitarian concern. Nixon responds, it's also on the tape, I know we can't blow up the world because of it. This was a Jew in power. You know the story that when Kissinger says to Golda, he says to Golda, and it's in the recent movie about Golda, just remember, what did he say? I'm an American first, I'm a this first, and I'm last a Jew. And Golda said to him, well, you know, we, the Jewish people, we write, W-R-I-T-E, from right to left. But Kissinger was in a very high position, and history is beginning to record the truth that in moments when he could have made a difference, he faltered. And then I write in the book all of this after quoting what Kissinger said on tape. If they put Jews in gas chambers, it's not an American concern. My God. All of this reinforced what I heard years earlier from my parents, who had friends who knew Kissinger's parents. We have great honor from our son, Kissinger's parents said, but little nachas. They were actually Washington Heights people. And so I want to read to you just the paragraph that Schumer now has from Open Up the Iron Door, page 84, when the sentences that we studied from the book of Esther was used in a very, very important meeting. Here's what it says. By the spring of 1974, Jackson-Vanik seemed back on track when word came of the vacillation of Senator Jacob Javits of New York, a longtime friend of the Jewish community, Israel, and Soviet Jewry. Now, that was very critical because Javits was an identified Jew, and if he was not going to vote for Jackson-Vanik, that would have opened the congressional floodgates, and many believe the amendment would never have passed. And here at the last moment, his knees were shaking. In a wonderful expression of solidarity, the Greater New York Conference on Soviet Jewry, which was the establishment group, if you can just point to the place, Julie, around the fourth line, and the SSSJ, which I ultimately came to chair, visited Javitz's office. Now, I was just one of 10 people, and I was a junior then. I was at the meeting, and I was very taken by Rabbi Gil Clapperman, whom later on he headed organizations. I had some differences, but he was a wonderful man, and this is what he did at this meeting. Talking to Javits, knowing that Javits was vacillating, and the fate of Soviet Jewry was in his hands. At that meeting, which I attended, Rabbi Gil Clapperman, speaking truth to power, retold the story of Purim, which was being celebrated around that time. Turning to Javits, he recalled that moment in the Megillah. He actually opened up the scroll of Esther. He recalled that moment when Queen Esther declines Mordechai's request to intervene for the Jews. Mordechai tells her, do not for a moment think you can escape your responsibilities as a Jew. If you intervene and make a difference, you will be blessed. If not, relief will come from elsewhere, and you will have lost your opportunity. It was Clapperman's way, Rabbi Clapperman's way of telling the senator, this is your moment. Don't blow it. And Javits didn't. He reaffirmed his full support for Jackson Vanik and those who are experts in the Soviet Jewry, like the late Jacob Birnbaum, who was the father of the movement, and Glenn Richter, the tzaddik of the movement. He should be well. Jacob has passed on. They will tell you, and I think everyone across the board, when I wrote this book, I was in close contact with Richard Pearl, who was then the chief of staff for Jackson. I went over and over each piece of this to make sure I had it absolutely correct. And if anybody wants a copy of the book, it would be my honor to send it to you, open up the iron door. And this is what Clapperman said to Javits. The amendment was passed, and these experts would say that it was the most important legislation that sprung Soviet Jewry. Once that was in place, once that stick was in place, it really began to open the doors. It didn't open right away, but in the 70s, it started to open. 79, it was halted because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, but it remained in place, even though a lot of people wanted to just turn it over and undo it. But because it remained in place, that was critical to the freedom of Soviet Jewry. And so in this piece, which hopefully will be published, and we do our best to publish it wherever we can. This is the kind of piece, I don't even send it to the New York Times for consideration. I know it's just not going to go anywhere. It's not where they're at. But towards the end of the piece, this is what I write. And maybe Shuli can put it up. It's the paragraph that begins with, as the holiday of Purim is soon to be celebrated. Now, I've given you the background of how Javits rose to the occasion, and let's make it as large as you can. If not, I'll just read it. As the holiday of Purim is soon to be celebrated by Jews around the world, Senator Schumer, if we can point to the place, who is the highest standing Jewish elected official in our country's history, must be reminded of the courage of Queen Esther 2 millennia ago, who was not fearful to intervene on behalf of the Jews. She did not escape her responsibilities as a Jew. Her intervention saved her people from destruction. Assuming risk for her statements and actions, she did not cave in. Schumer did. You know, for those with whom I've had a lot of contact and with whom we've grown up together, there was a time when I was younger when, as you know, as a firebrand, I was very critical of opponents. And I regret that too often I was over the top. As I get older, I'm more reticent. It was very hard for me to write this piece, even about Schumer. And I don't have a good relationship with Schumer. In fact, I include here an anecdote, which is not a pleasant anecdote, but just to give you a sense of my relationship with him, how I know him. I write here that as a rabbi activist for decades, I have seen up close how Schumer is first and foremost, these are hard words, interested in his personal political well-being. Then I write, during the second Intifada, thousands gathered to raise a voice as many scores of Israeli citizens, including Americans, were murdered by Palestinian terrorists. The organizers of the rally, an interdenominational group of rabbis, wonderful rabbis, conservative Rabbi Wexler, Jeremy, who attended our yeshiva for a while, his father, a reform rabbi, was involved. Shmuel Golden was involved. Bruce Ginsburg was involved. Really, across the spectrum, there were Reconstructionist rallies. It was an international group. The establishment wasn't moving on it, and so we pushed. And so this group of international rabbis decided that politicians, for that matter, Israeli representatives, would not speak. You know, there are two kinds of rally. There's a rally where the politicians speak to the people, and then there's a rally where the people speak to the politicians. We were so outraged. We wanted people to speak to the politicians. That's what we wanted. And there were many political figures that were present. There were 8,000 people at that particular rally. I remember the number clearly. And the political figures present understood our decision, with one exception. And that was the good senator from New York, Chuck Schumer. He was incensed. And for weeks after he called my little office in the Bayit, we didn't have a building on the highway, and he would call seeking to express his outrage that he was not given the pulpit. I purposely used the noun, the pulpit. And so some of you may not recognize me as being so strident, but I'm really upset with him at what he did. And so I spoke about what happened a year later, a few days after the Park Hotel in Netanya was attacked. Remember that? It was Pesach of 2002 by Palestinian terrorists. 30 people were killed on the first night of Pesach. This time we gathered, we were 12,000 people packed into Dag HaMashal Plaza, just across from the United Nations. The rally this time was open to politicians. And I'll never forget this. All graciously waited their turn to speak, but not Schumer. He arrived late, and when he did, he not only demanded to be the next speaker, but he demanded that I hurry up the person speaking as he's talking too long. I've got to go. I want to do my thing. I got to go. I'm the senior senator. He bellowed, I insist on speaking now. And that's why I'm sure he remembers these incidents. It was in the scope of everything, it was small. And the reason I included this, you know, I call this piece, it's a very tough title, I call it Schumer's cowardly courage. He said, if I could face everyone, he says something and then he flinches. This is his MO. And it's his MO. Like when voting with Israel, he looks to the right, he looks to the left to make sure he's in a politically safe place. And his courage is often punctuated with cowardice. Again, this is from the piece. This characteristic of courage, but, is it safe? And that's why I use the term, this dialectic of cowardly courage, was on display in 2015 when he voted against President Obama's Iran nuclear deal. Even as an on-the-record naysayer, Schumer did far too little to lobby against the bill's passing. As Politico wrote at the time, quote, Schumer did not try to get his colleagues to change their minds, even on the question of whether a filibuster of a disapproval resolution was appropriate for such a weighty matter, end quote. And of course, years later, he did an about-face, becoming a strong proponent of reviving the deeply flawed agreement. And so my message to Chuck Schumer, and I hope, because hopefully this will appear in the news or in the Post, and it's not the Wall Street Journal, but still they're papers that are widely read in New York, and I wanted it to be in a paper. And there was one editor who was kind enough to think that it was worthy of publication and accepted it. But again, you never know what's in until it's in. But here, I talk about how, I don't mention it openly, how Javits spoke truth to power in the end. He heeded Rabbi Clapperman's call, but Schumer did not. And I end with these very harsh words, and then we'll open it up for your comments. I write, talking about Queen Esther assuming risk for her statements and actions, she, heeding Mordechai's call, did not cave in. Schumer did. And if we can go to the piece again as we finish. How dare he preach to Israel? How dare Schumer preach to Israel as my grandchildren join hundreds of thousands of Israelis putting their lives on the line, fighting a just war for its very existence, while doing all it can to protect innocent Palestinians. How dare he unforgivably equate, as he did in the latter part of his Senate speech, Hamas and Prime Minister Netanyahu as equal obstacles to peace. Could you imagine? Could you imagine? He said that there are 4 obstacles to peace. And one of them was Hamas, and another one was the Prime Minister of Israel. What a tragedy to put the two together in the same breath. How dare he abuse his Jewishness as a selling point to berate Israel, undermining its right to choose its government without interventions Americans bitterly condemn in our own elections. For Israelis, this is a time not only of studying history, but of living history. Whatever happens today will be recorded for posterity. For now, Schumer is politically protected. His speech falls in line with many of the sentiments of the Democratic Party, but the annals of Jewish history may not be so kind. Years from now, his speech, I believe, will be seen as a betrayal, precisely when Israel needed help the most. Mi Yodea, I could face everyone, Mordechai says. I hear those words constantly. Who knows? Im la'ed kazo tigat l'malchut. Rav Avi, what do you think before you run? maybe Ari already left. Okay, we'll open this up. And
I have a question.
I do want to encourage you before Purim, read chapter 4 of the Megillah, please.
I see Estelle's hand. I'd love to make a list. So can I see anyone else's hand if anyone else wants to say something? I see Estelle and Elaine. Am I missing anyone right now? Okay, let's start with Estelle and then Elaine. And then Susan.
There's no getting away from the fact that I agree with you completely, Avi. And I spoke to my kids, and they were in Israel, that is, and they were just down on Schumer. They expressed exactly as you did. However, I just want to point out one thing. Javits lost the election, whereas Schumer is still around, maybe to do some good. And by sheer coincidence, Javits and we were on the same plane going to Israel right after that. And I remember going over to him and saying that I mean, even though he was a Republican, etc., I admired him and I thanked him for what he did say. But let's face it, he lost the election and he was out of power. So what good is something? You need to be in power in order to do anything. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. I'd like to think that often being a Jew makes it more difficult for us to speak out for Jewish causes. And I'd like to think if I had to choose between being an elected official or being a Jew speaking truth to power, I'm a Jew first. I'll never vote if I'm in government, the American government, against the American interest.
But you have a pulpit. You have a pulpit, therefore you can say that. But I agree with you, but that isn't the way life is.
My basic principle of activism is the true spiritual activist, you've heard me say this, Estelle, is the one who stands up for a cause, not because it's popular, but because it's right. Not to save and secure one's possession, because it's the right thing to do. And in the end, even if short term, it could hurt you, as you're pointing out with Javits, in the end, as Mordechai says, what Javits is going to be remembered for is being a great friend of Soviet Jewry. People are not going to remember. Many people on this don't remember when Javits was in office. When he wasn't in office, it was his moment, and Javits stood up. I'll give you another example. In those times, I traveled with Avital Sharansky, and we were told that Avital very much wanted to meet Secretary of State George Shultz, and she had no way to contact him. But we were told that the president, a very good man, the president of DuPont in Delaware, a man by the name of Irving Shapiro. Again, I have this Raymond kind of memory, unfortunately. I remember too many things. That he was a close buddy of Schultz. So Avital and I went to see him, and she broke down telling him the story of Natan, and Shapiro's a Jew. Tells him the story of Natan Sharansky, her husband, and I'll never forget, he looked at her and said, I appreciate it, but the secretary is too busy to hear your concerns about one person, even if it's your husband. And by the way, in the end, and at that point, she stood up, and generally when I was with her, she did the speaking. She's a very humble, quiet person. For those who know, I think she was the greatest Jewish activist of the latter part of the 20th century. I really think it was Avital. I tell Natan even more than Natan, as great as Natan was, and Natan has real greatness. But I do remember standing up and I said to him, Mr. Shapiro, this was your moment. This was your Esther moment. And you're going to regret this. And guess what? Avital in the end somebody else introduced her to George Shultz. And George Shultz became one of the strongest advocates for Soviet Jewry, and in particular, the release of Natan Sharansky. Shapiro, I don't know how long he remained as chairman of DuPont, this wealthy company, but when they write history, that's the way I believe it's going to be recorded. And that last paragraph that I shared with you from the piece is important. What we do now, especially with Israel's war, existential war, is history. And one has to assess what I do, not only in terms of what's happening now, but 50 years from now, 100 years from now, how will it be viewed? And even though someone like Schumer still remains in power, he's safe as long as the Democrats are the majority, who'll be the majority leader in the Senate. I don't think, as I write, I don't think history are going to, I think this is going to be the example, a very prime example, because Israel, even more than Soviet Jewry, is so central, even though Soviet Jewry is so central. I think it'll be said that at a moment of Israel's greatest need, he wasn't there. Again, I know he said great things, but the more I read that speech, the more upset I get with him. You know, on a certain level,
he irritates me.
On a certain level, when you say good things, it makes the bad things you say more credible. It legitimizes the bad things. I'm very, you know, I use the word livid. It's a very hard word. And so if anybody else wants to make a comment, we're gonna bring this to a close.
So we have Elaine, followed by Susan, followed by Wendy, followed by Lance. So Elaine.
Okay, and that'll
you're
be
muted, Elaine.